This is a can capacitor. Well, it's a drawing of a can capacitor. And in your old school hi-fi amplifier or your old school guitar or instrument amplifier, this might be what you see for your power filter stage coming off of your rectifier tube. Well, these are great because they take up a very little amount of space, and if you want to get a replacement, they are not that expensive. But for about the same amount of money and for a lot more time, you could, or if you had the extra components laying around, you could convert your can capacitor to these sort of axial capacitors, which has its benefit and has its drawbacks. So let's dive in and see how we can get our conversion done. The first thing to consider, number one, is we need to understand schematics. If you are someone who is interested in doing this and who has who searched for this video, you probably have a general understanding of electronics, but we got to make sure that we nail this down before you attempt to do anything that you just saw. So this is a little snippet of a larger schematic for a project which I'm working on, and you can see the video will be up on my channel for my conversion, but I wanted to just do this little piece here. So the first thing to understand is this would be our rectifier tube here, and I didn't complete the rest of it because it didn't matter. What I wanted to show you is this would be pin 3. This is coming off of the cathode. Okay, it's going to hit our first resistor. Okay, that is going to be at a junction with the first capacitor, which goes off to ground and then off to supply voltage, the next resistor, and so on and so forth. Okay, when you see the R, that means obviously a resistor, and it's numbered R58. Also, if you don't see the R58, if you see this squiggly line here, that is another way to say resistor, or sometimes they have just a rectangle that you can put on there. Okay, now this circle here, or this dot, is what is indicative of a junction between the capacitor and where the voltage supply goes. So this will all make sense more when you understand it in the context of actually an amplifier, but what you also have at the same junction is the positive end of an axial capacitor, where the negative goes off to ground. Every time you see this symbol here, that means to ground. Okay, and then here, and then we have another resistor, another junction, another capacitor to ground. Another resistor, another junction, another capacitor to ground. All right, let's zoom in on these a little bit more. Okay, so notice that these are all three called C52. Okay, they're all C52, which means that it's all one can. Okay, now there's a 40 UF, a 30 UF, and a 15 UF component. And notice how we have the positive end indicated, but also this little symbol here. So we have a half moon, or half circle, a square, and a triangle. Okay, when we go back to our can here, you'll notice that there's a half circle, a square, and a triangle. Each of them have different points here. These are just the twist tabs. And these are probably the terminals here. Okay? So now you should have some kind of understanding of what that's going to look like. So once you understand your schematics, next step is you're going to make a plan, and I recommend you draw it out. So this is what I've done with my previous amplifier that I just mentioned, and this really helped me to kind of visualize what I was going to do here. So the first thing is, so our first stage coming off of the cathode of the rectifier tube is we have a resistor and a junction. And you'll notice here we have this is our rectifier tube, the cathode. We have a resistor, a 10 watt resistor, and a junction. Okay, cool, right? And at this junction, we have our 40 UF capacitor with the positive heading towards the junction and the negative heading off to ground. Okay, and then at this same junction, we also have our voltages. In this case, it's a 320 volt to the output transformers. Okay, cool, right? Now, moving on from there, you have another set of resistors, right? So R59 is a 220 ohm 5 watt resistor. That means what I did is I took two resistors that are each 5 watt and I put them in series so you can just add the two resistances together. You still need to have, you can't add wattage capabilities, but you can add resistance capabilities. So if you want a 5 watt, if it calls for a 5 watt resistor, you need to have two or more. The minimum value needs to be 5, and then you just add the two values together. Okay, so those two go to the next junction, which is the 30 UF, and this, which supplies voltage to this other grid of the output tubes. Okay, off to ground, carrying on. This 1200 watt resistor, or 1200 ohm resistor to this smaller capacitor, and then this 250 volt voltage goes to the preamp tubes. Okay, so that should kind of help visualize what exactly you need to be doing. That's all that the CAN did previously. It just put them all in the same place. So, okay, once you have your plan in place, next is we're going to source the components. And this, I think, is a really fun part of the process. You get to find, which deals are what and from which places. Oh, I like these ones, I don't like these ones. And here's a couple resources for you. The first is going to be antiqueelectronicsupply.com. Usually these guys have everything that you need. Very specific values. Or you want to buy in bulk and ship it all at once. If Antique Electronics Supply doesn't have it, I usually like to support these guys because they're a smaller business. You can try partsexpress.com, and these guys definitely will have it, or at least something very close to it. Much larger warehouse. Or if you don't want to do all of this, and this just is a lot of complicated extra work, you can actually have custom CAN capacitors rebuilt for you at heysaidhamfest.com, and for very inexpensive too. I mean, to get all of these components that I sourced here, I think it was about, let's say $50. And I think the replacement CAN was darn near close to that. The difference is this is going to be, going to take you a week to get your components, and this will take you weeks. I don't know how many, but I know it's not like they're just going to, throw a CAN capacitor together for you really quick. So anyway, those are your three options there. And then after you're done with that, take your time, enjoy it, go out in the garage and turn on some music and double check your work, and don't be in a rush to do any of this. This is not something that you want to just do really quick. So let's talk about the rules. Number 1, when you're sourcing a component, make sure that the new voltage rating is equal to or greater than the original rating. A capacitor can handle more voltage than what it's can handle more voltage than what it needs to, but cannot handle more voltage than it's made to. So just make sure that if your schematic calls for a, say, 400 volt capacitor, that you get at 400 at least, or even 500. Number 2, radial capacitors are the same as axial. In other words, if you get capacitors that look like that or that look like that, they do the same thing. Just make sure that you mind the polarities. As you can see, this one has a negative symbol pointing towards this lead, where this one has a positive symbol indicating the positive side. So just keep that in mind. Okay, next rule. Get as close to the original microfarad rating as possible. Now, the debate is still going on as far as how exactly this works, because one thing to consider is that old ratings for capacitors made in the 60s are different than what they are nowadays. So, you know, I don't know. I try to get as close to it as possible. But if you have, this schematic calls for a 15 microfarad here. I'd say, and what I did with my project was I put in a 16 microfarad, and I believe that's going to be just fine because they have tolerances anyway. So, unless you need a very, very specific value and you need to spend a lot of money on your capacitor, then don't worry about it. And the fourth most important rule is, before you start, if you're somebody who's made it this far and if you're watching this video, you probably already know, but I'm going to say it anyway because a bunch of people warned me. Even if your amplifier is super old, those old capacitors could still very well be holding on to a lethal amount of voltage. Seriously, you can die if you touch a capacitor that's full of like 400 volts and you are grounded and it goes through, you can stop your heart. So make sure that you safely drain old capacitor caps, and there are plenty of videos on YouTube about how to do that, so I'm not going to make one. Those are the rules. Lastly, make sure that you have fun. Head out into the garage, put on some music, give yourself a beverage, take your time and enjoy it. So that's all. Thank you. Be sure to give me a like and a subscribe. Thanks.